Greetings and welcome to another episode of Right. I'm your host, Farrell D. Moore, and I'm going to be interviewing today's author, Joel Roosa, author of All Worlds Awakening. How you doing, Joel?
I'm doing fine. Thanks for asking.
Oh, good, good. Well, let's get right to the interview then. Joel, in All Worlds Awakening, what part of the book did you have the hardest time writing? The beginning, the middle, the end of it, or?
Well, the beginning was easy because you don't, at the beginning, I didn't have to establish earth-shaking anything. It's just you're winding up with the characters, and the characters are winding up so you meet them. And
right.
I throw a little bit of exposition in there and some personality, and then I got to make things happen with them later on. It's like, of course, the book is in sections, so there's several different characters throughout the book, although I would say the first two of Harry and Nia are the main characters. And I tend to lean a little towards Nia myself because she's a smart. But the ending of the wrap up was kind of like, so the middle wasn't too hard. It's like all this stuff is happening. And then I probably should end it at some point here because it was going to be longer originally, and I happened to think the people are only usually wanting like 90,000 words or so these days for a first book. And then it's like, okay, we'll wrap it up here. It's like, 87,000 something, I think. And it's like, this is a good spot to start.
Yep.
And that's how it went, basically. It's like, so it wasn't, I'm not sure that any part of the book was the hardest, except maybe having to wrap it up. That's kind of like, when do you stop?
Yeah, the ending's got to be tough.
Yeah.
You've got to draw the line somewhere. You're planning a sequel, aren't you?
Oh, yeah. I've already finished All Worlds Asunder, which is the second book. And I just finished All Worlds Anarchy. These get just a little bit worse as they go on in a way. Like things happen. It's like I'm not a gloom and doom kind of writer as a rule, but things get a bit worse as things go on, and I'm assuming things will be better by the end of the series, but I don't really know. Maybe I'll get all morose, and by that time things will be horrible. I mean, I doubt it somehow.
Well, how many books are you planning in the series?
Eight of them. It's an octology, I guess that's what you'd call it.
8 of them.
Or I guess you could say, the 8th book of the trilogy was the joke with the book. What was the series there by Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy? There was the fourth book was thanks and goodbye and thanks for all the fish, and that was the fourth book in the Hitchhiker's trilogy. I'm like,
right?
Yeah, okay, that's cute. And they may think there may have been more since then too. I'm not really sure, but yeah, I'm planning on 8, and I have a vague idea of at least the tone of the books,
right?
And I don't know. They all tend to be generally positive. I mean, I like the heroic ideal, of
Will you generally scope the sequels out?
I have, the second and third are done, and I just have a general idea what's happening with the ones after that. More like goals, and I don't always know how things going to end up till I get there. I'm a pantser rather than a plotter, as the saying goes, I guess these days. I actually had a hard time with the third book because I had no idea what I was doing. It took me like half the book to figure out, oh, okay, now I know where we're going. Then it got faster. But I usually only have just a vague idea of where I'm heading because it's fun getting there.
Well, they generally divide writings into 2 camps, pantsers and plotters. But I've seen the third element come into play too. It's called plantsers, partially, plotting and partially pantsing, right?
Yeah, I can tell you. Well, I do. I do a little bit of planning. I mean, harkening back to high school English, when you had to do notes and all this kind of stuff for a term paper, and you had to have it all written down, you had to turn it in, and I did enough notes and things for a lifetime that I hated that. What I do is I have notes, and what I'll actually often do is have them at the end of the material I'm looking for on a book, so I don't forget them, but I see them, so I know where I'm heading.
Or you write notes on your books?
It's at the end of what I'm working on, so I have to work that in somewhere. Like that book can't end until I do that. That's an important plot point, that kind of thing there.
Right.
But so I don't make copious notes, I guess you would say. I don't have, okay, in chapter 6, blah, blah, blah has to happen here and here, and I devote 3 pages to this and this. I can't do that.
I was talking to Jude Matlich Hall yesterday, and she said that her book, The Everseen Chronicles, came out of notes. I thought she had a momentous book, right? Just written in notes and everything. But it turns out she'd only written 354 words, right? And she only used half of that to write the book. So she's a tremendous pantser.
Yeah, there you go. See, now actually I didn't know that about Jude, because when I talked to her before, or through emails anyway, I kind of got the feeling too that she planned a lot of this stuff out, and not really so much, I guess. That's kind of funny. Jeez, that kind of makes sense. But
Let's get back to your book, All Words Awakening. By the way, it's available through Whitecap Publications, right?
Yeah.
And Amazon right now, and soon to be at bookstores everywhere. But which of the characters do you relate to the most, and why? Because you got a lot of characters in your book.
Yeah.
The first book, because you got to introduce a lot of characters, I guess, to carry through for the sequels.
Right. Yeah. Almost everyone in the first book shows up in the sequels at some point or another, some to one degree or another.
Right.
Harry and Nee are in every book so far, and so are Håkon and Twill. And also Khalilith in the first book is kind of majorly important in the third book. And I get complaints from people that I don't have like an appendix or something explaining everything. It's like, I can understand maybe an appendix explaining this material is a magic material, does something, this is this, but I don't know too many books that have copious notes referring to the previous books. Kind of like, if you want to know, then read the previous book.
Right. That's true. That's true.
I can see when I mention certain, there's a gray metal called Thessi in the third book, Thesi. It's supposed to be magically inert. So it has a certain value because you can't alter it with magic, and it defends them with magic, but it's too brittle to be made into weapons. But it has uses, but I mentioned that early in the book, but I don't mention it, on every dang page thereafter. Right. And people say, well, what's this? I mentioned that when the beginning of the chapter. How many times? I don't know. How many times am I supposed to mention something? It just, I don't know. It's like, because it's hard to tell when you know it yourself. Like, well, how often should I bring something up?
Well, if you mention it, minimalistic, people will complain about it. If you maximize your mentioning it, people will complain about it. So you got to be somewhere in the middle, right? I think. But which of the characters do you relate to the most? Honestly, you've got tons of characters in the first book.
Yeah.
Who do you relate to?
Well, I would have to say that in general, I relate to the Valdurian characters, or the ones that are kind of more behind the scenes. Well, for a couple reasons, but I've had those characters since the 70s, for crying out loud. Little things I write for myself and this and that. And in my D&D days, I worked into my D&D adventures too. So I have a certain fondness for them. And
right.
It's like particularly the one Caroline. He doesn't show up a lot in the first book, but he's kind of my character, so I sort of relate to him. He's the guy who's kind of in charge. Like, yeah, okay.
Wait a minute, you invented these characters by your exposure to D&D?
Well, they have been developed by the exposure, although most of them existed prior to D&D, which I think started in '74. I started playing in '76. I don't really play anymore. It's just, well, if for nothing else, it's hard to get people together. Like at the end of the day, people went off to college, to jobs, got married, moved, this and this, and it's like, and plus these days it's hard for me to do any kind of effort that takes that much time. So, in a night, it's like, always enjoyed it though. It's like it's like, people liken writers to, people thinking they're gods. And I get that, because you get to create a universe and control what happens in it.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, I guess so.
And that's kind of what happens in D&D, only when you create the adventures, you don't have nearly as much control, because players will do funny things that usually cracked me up, but like, you can only control the adventure to some extent.
Yeah.
Some people, well, you can make anything happen. Well, that's true, but if I can make anything happen, what's the point of having players? If they can't affect the game in some way, if I don't need them to make the adventure happening, then what's the point? Then I just write a book. I don't need players. I write the book and control everything that happens. So,
right. Hence the God complex, right?
Yeah, exactly. The whole thing again. I get that. I totally
Now,
get it.
by the way, how would you classify All Worlds Awakening? Is it fantasy or fantasy action or?
Yes, it's I would say primarily fantasy action, also fantasy science fiction. I know, I think these days classifications can get a bit sloppy with things.
They can.
But it's primarily fantasy, but there's certainly science fiction elements to it.
Right.
I mean, considering it's all worlds, they do travel to different worlds of varying levels of technology. Some magic is the thing, some technology thing. Some of it happens on an Earth anyway. Perhaps not this one, but that was my thing. Is like, well, it's a sci fantasy action, I guess.
Right.
Not horror, though. I'm not really into horror, although I've written a few grisly things here and there, but not so much into horror. But yeah, but everything can be sweet and light and everything.
Well, true.
You got to break it up once in a while.
Now, what significant way has your book changed since your first draft? Do you write a first draft and just refine it, or do you go back and change a lot?
Well, primarily, the first draft just gets edited, altered. I wouldn't say that I do a complete second draft, but I mean, things get altered, of course. I mean,
right.
I shift chapters around, or I will occasionally change plot.
You don't do a second draft, though, do you?
Not really. No, not like, well, it's done. Let's redo another version of it. I'm changing it as I go along usually.
Just wait, and it's done pretty much, but you edit what you've done.
I edit the living daylights out of it when it's done usually, yeah.
Yep.
And so technically, I guess you'd call this the second or third draft, because some things did change significantly as it went through, and I had to move some things out of the book into the next book because it just wouldn't fit right. It's like, because I had this thing planned, had this thing in a dream from years ago, and I can't use it really, so that moved to the second book. But
now, this is a good question. Did you your All Worlds Awakening, was it developed in a dream?
No.
Or did you have dreams about your characters?
I've had that happen. I would say that the All Worlds thing came first. The hardest thing was coming up with the All Worlds part. Like, let's go be a book about the multiverse. Yeah, let's call it multiverse. No, let's not do that. It's just, I don't think it has that much of an appeal title-wise. Right. It was like back in the day when Stan Lee created the X-Men. His boss, Martin Goodman, said, well, he was going to call it the Mutants first. And his boss said, no one's going to know what mutants are, Stan. Come up with a better title than that. And he's like, okay, we'll call it the X-Men. Oh, X for extra power, or that X factor. Or,
right,
yeah,
right.
It was catchy, regardless of X-Men. And we're like, what the hell does X stand for? But and I think a lot of people would know what mutants were, but it's certainly a catchier title than mutants.
Yeah, what inspired the idea for your book? I'm curious.
Well, I had all these characters running around in my head, and I needed something to do with them.
Right.
It's like I had stories that I wanted to tell. I didn't always have these particular characters in mind, but I had stories I wanted to tell, and I figured all this character work good. Like the first chapter almost starts off like film noir. Like Harry's in the office and Nia shows up, and like that was exactly what I had in mind. which was also funny because Jude's book kind of started off that way too, like a film noir thing. Like, okay, that was interesting. And
now, what book did you say started out like that?
All Worlds Awakening. The first chapter is Harry's in his office, and Nia shows up, and he's like the old school detective sitting at his desk with his hat over his eyes.
Now, what book is that similar to?
Well, Jude's first book starts off.
Oh, right. Everseen Chronicles.
Right. There's a character in an office, and the buxom blonde comes in, like, well, that sounds familiar. It's like we're both working on the same thing there.
Sure.
Yeah. And,
let's see. How would you describe your book's ideal reader? What age packet would they be in? What orientation would they have? Are they female or male?
Yeah, well, let's see now. I don't know if it might appeal more to males than females. I'm not really sure. I've had mixed reviews from people that say one thing or the other, so I'm not sure. Maybe it appeals more to guys because I tend to have really attractive women in it, but I'm not sure if that's necessarily a thing that only appeals to guys, or depending on orientation, I suppose.
Right.
But then again, it's like it would be people who are like who always love good old rock'em sock'em fantasy literature.
Right.
People magic and dragons, and people that solve problems with swords. And then again, also some people that solve problems with their brains too, with swords. Right. But that sort of thing. I mean, anybody. I don't know if I would appeal to a Game of Thrones fan or not. I've never read Game of Thrones, but I know it's fantasy. And I guess there's dragons, but I don't know. If there's much similarity. I don't tend to kill characters off a lot.
Yeah. It's a soap opera with fantasy, right?
Yeah, that's what kind of the
dragons thrown in. It's really good, though. I mean,
I heard it's really good.
Yeah. Now, what perspectives or beliefs? The final question, the tough question: what perspectives or beliefs did you challenge in your book? Did you challenge anything?
I don't know that I challenged anything. I have to think there was. Well, I did challenge that. You're not alone. It's like there are, multiple universes, not only just different dimensions, but alternate realities, the worlds where you make a decision and something's different in that one. I don't get too much into that, but
right.
I can't say I really challenged anything except maybe people's idea of how fantasy stories should go. I'm not really sure in some cases. It's like, well, the women are as much of the hero as the men, and maybe more so in some cases.
Right.
So that maybe challenged a little bit, but I didn't attack religious beliefs particularly, except of course that if you accept the fact that gods exist in these universes, like Greek gods or whatever, does that challenge the Christian God? Actually, not really. I always figure it's like, yeah, you can do your thing, for a while. It's like that kind of thing. Like, I won't bother you.
Okay. Well,
let's see. Challenge much, yeah.
Yeah. All right. Let's end the interview on that note, but we'll come back to 4 more interviews.
Okay.
Your book. We explore your book, the details of your book. It's been fascinating talking with you, by the way, Joel.
Thank you as well.
The name of the book is All Worlds Awakening, and it's available through White Cat Publications. And until the next episode, we'll see you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.